first installment of my new podcast, which is going to be called Story of My Life. I'm going to tell stories from my past, some from my present, and true stories. I don't have to depend on memory 100% because I've been keeping a diary since I was 9 years old. So I have somewhere upwards of 40 volumes of my diary, and I can consult that if I'm ever hazy on some of the details. But memory is what it is, and I'm not guaranteeing that every single thing will be 100% accurate, but I'll try to get to the truth of the matter in every case. I was signed to London Records when I was 25 years old, and I made a big budget album, relatively big. For those days, it was $83,000 is what my album cost to make. It was produced by David Spinoza, the great David Spinoza, who's a fantastic studio guitar player. His most noteworthy, pardon the pun, moment as a studio guitar player was to play the solo to Right Place, Wrong Time. And I'm going to appropriate that story someday in this series as one of my own. Well, at least I'll tell it from my vantage point as he told it to me one night. And he produced Walking Man for James Taylor, etc., etc., produced me for London Records. And so a lot of my stories are going to have some reminiscing about musical moments, celebrity run-ins, but it won't be TMZ. It's not going to be like the dirt on the stars. There's a lot of little beautiful quiet moments that have happened too over the years musically that I'll share with you. This first installment is going to be one of the stories that will be in the minority, I think, of stories that will be sad. I hope that a lot of them will have humor in them. But this story I call The Watchung Walker, and it's about a time that I was living in my parents' abandoned house. They had moved out, and I was the caretaker for their house in Watchung, New Jersey, which was on a big hill behind Bess Lake, beautiful lake. And I was on the edge of 26 acres of woods. And so there was a lot of wildlife happening around the pond. A pond is always an attractive area for wildlife. One morning, after an all-nighter, actually, I was up at 7 in the morning, and I looked out, and there were two young foxes playing with each other, just like little pups running around and fighting each other and rolling around in the grass. It was incredible to see. And I've seen a lot of things, and some of those I'll share with you about living behind a pond. But over the years, I lived there for 20-some years, and I saw all kinds of things. Let me give you an example. One night, I was getting ready to go out to church on New Year's Eve, a church service. I was going to play a song, and I heard a crash, and I looked out my front window, and I saw the tail lights of a car, which turned out to be a Mercedes 450 SL that had crashed through the ice on New Year's Eve. And I saw the taillights protruding, flashing, and I called 911 instantly, and I ran out to my garage at the top of the hill, at the top of the driveway, and I grabbed the quickest thing that I thought might be of use, which I couldn't find a rope, so I grabbed a long orange industrial extension cord, and I ran down the driveway, which is about a quarter of a mile long, and I ran down in the dark and in the ice and snow, so I had to kind of pick my way carefully down there. It took me a couple of minutes, and by the time I got down, to him. The police and the fire department had already gotten there. They had fished him out. He was coughing up water on the banks. So it was a close call. It was, and I said to one of the policemen or firemen, I said, well, I have a long orange industrial extension cord if anybody needs one. And they didn't particularly see the humor in that. And they were like, okay, Mac, hit the road. So now in the 1980s, my friend Peter Hay, who had been the A&R man who signed me to London Records, used to come out from Manhattan several days a week. I would pick him up at the train station. See, this is real, spontaneous. I'm not fixing anything in post-production, so I'm going to stumble on words occasionally. You might even hear a silence or two. And I'm doing this late at night, so it has kind of a late night vibe to it. Or they will have kind of a late night vibe to them. But, listen to them at any time of the day. That's the purpose of a podcast and the general convenience of them. So Peter used to come out, and we were working on my record label. I started a record label in the 80s called Notebook Records, which exists to this day as a vehicle for my wife's albums and my albums. And we have about 12 or 13 records out now on Notebook Records. But it started in the 80s. And so he would come out, and I would look out the front window, out to the pond and out to Valley Road, as we worked on things. And so one day, I remember it was in the winter, and I saw in the bleak midwinter, so to speak, a very large man, 250 easily or more pounds, and he was wearing a large black overcoat, and he was walking in the cold, and I didn't think much of it. And then I started to see him every single day. And not only did I see him, but basically everybody in Watchung saw him. And other people, I guess, aren't like me in some ways. They weren't that curious about him, but I was. I wondered what his story was. And he just walked everywhere all day long, in any kind of weather, and you'd see him 5-6 times a day. And so Peter and I started calling him the Watchung Walker. And over the months, as the weather got nicer, he started to shed both pounds and clothes. So when the weather was warm, he was walking in shorts, and he must have lost 50 or more pounds. So he became not overly skinny, but he just became, he looked like he was in good shape, but he wasn't. He wasn't in good shape. He was troubled mentally. And I found out later that he was a returning veteran. And he had been, I believe, in the Vietnam War. But in any event, I remember one time I was down at the Triangle, we used to call it, in Watchung, and there was, a 7-Eleven or a Wawa, whatever it was, down there. Some of you know it. And I remember I was a fly on the wall when he came in during one of his walks. And I kind of hid in the corner and watched him, and he bought like a huge industrial sized bottle of Coke, the real stuff, not Diet Coke, and he bought all sugar snacks like junk food, and then he consumed them right there in the store, and he probably drank half of a bottle of one of those big bottles of Coke, and I thought, that's not going to do him too much good. But anyway, one night, Peter and I went out to some function. I don't remember what it was necessarily, but it was probably some music business thing or a gig. It was more likely a gig that we went to. And Peter was driving, and it was late at night. By the way, people had seen the Watchung Walker all over the town. And in fact, some people had reported him to the police. They were upset about him. He showed up on their front porch or something, I heard. And so people didn't really know what to make of him. And I, in my curious and hopefully communicative way, I wanted to somehow reach out to him. And I didn't know how. But he was walking one night in the moonlight by the side of a busy road down there. And we drove by him, and I wasn't driving, I remember. Peter was driving that night. I think I had a couple of drinks. I had a couple of cognac somewhere. And so I wasn't impaired, but I was just sitting in the passenger seat, and I saw him, and maybe I was a little bit tipsy, I don't know, because I rolled down the window, and as we passed by, I yelled, I hope not too unkindly, but I yelled, "Stop walking!" I didn't know what else to say, and I just had 10 seconds to say something as we went by. You can't say, "Hi, I'm Chip Mergott, nice to meet you." Well, we got to the house up on the hill behind the pond, Best Lake, and I knew that he was going to have to pass down on the other side of the pond. He always did. He walked down Valley Road to get to where he was staying. And so in the few minutes that I had, and now it's around 11:30 at night, I'm guessing, and kind of a brightly lit night by the moon. And here's where it gets where some guitar players and gearheads might be interested in this. I pulled out my big Super Reverb Fender amp, which is a great tube amp that I owned, and I put it on the front porch, and I pulled out my white Stratocaster with the maple neck, and I plugged it in, and then I thought to myself, what would I play for this guy? And I thought, well, the only thing I could think of to play that can convey some kind of thought that I'm trying to convey was Amazing Grace. So I started playing. I just was playing the melody. I wasn't playing the chords. I was just playing like a trumpet player would play. And, it was loud, and I wasn't thinking about the volume, and this big pond was like a huge echo chamber, and all of a sudden, he passes by on the other side of the pond in the moonlight, and I play him Amazing Grace, and then I hear the phone ring, and it's 11:30 at night, and I go, oh no. And I ran in the house, and it was my across-the-street neighbor, a nice guy named Jeff. And he and his wife Gwen lived across the street, and they had a big house full of kids. They had 8 or 9 kids at the time, and I think they ended up with 10 or 12 kids. My wife is one of 11, so the family across the street had 10 kids at least, ultimately. But Jeff was on the phone, and he said, "Chip, what are you doing?" in a sleepy voice. He said, "You woke me up." And I was profusely apologizing. I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." He goes, "Was that Amazing Grace?" And I said, "Yes, it was." And I said, "I was playing for the Watchung Walker." And he said, "Okay, well, you've been a good neighbor for the last 15 years, but, don't play loud music after 11 o'clock at night, okay?" And I apologized, and I hung up. Well, the sad ending, I'm afraid, is that one day the Watchung Walker stopped walking. We didn't see him for a while. And a couple of weeks went by, and he had been out there so many times in every kind of weather, day in and day out, that finally, again, my curiosity aspect was I called the police and I said, "Do you know the Watchung Walker?" They were like, "Yeah." I said, "What happened to him?" And they said, "Well, the policeman said, I'm sorry to say, he's gone. He passed away." And I said, "Oh no!" And it got worse. He said he was very troubled. He had had bad experiences during the war, and he was kind of shell shocked. And he actually stabbed himself with a military bayonet. Oh, this was so sad and so distressing. And they said it was a terrible mess. When we got there, there was blood everywhere, and he passed away. And I didn't know what to say. I just felt terrible, and I thought, what these people go through who have to go to war, and then they come home and they can't always find the help that they need. And that's what happens when Johnny comes marching home.